ShareMarket.com.
On behalf of British Workers Forum, I'd like to welcome Steve Headley, who's the ex-leader of the RMT and a leading trade union activist, and Dalwinder Atwal, who's a leading representative of the Indian Work Association, GB, and we also got Jacob from the Revolutionary Communist Group. So today we're going to be discussing the development that have taken place in Venezuela. What is the aim of the US in doing what it's done in Venezuela?
I think there are a number of aims. Primarily, I mean, it's about seizing the oil wealth of Venezuela. Venezuela are one of the countries who've got the most natural resources is when it comes to oil and gas. But I think probably even a greater reason to that is the fact that China and Russia take a lot of the oil from Venezuela. And this is a message to China. I think that they're going to be their challenge, both economic and militarily, to America is going to be met ferociously by the Americans. You know, they're not going to let China become the hegemon in the world. They're not going to countenance China becoming the primary power in the world. So I think that's the other reason, and obviously it's a threat to any other nation that is aligning itself with China or Russia, or indeed trying to get independence from America. That they will be dealt with in a similar way. So I think all those factors come into play.
Devinder, from the Indian Work Association, what do you think is the main aim behind what's happened in Venezuela?
As you know, the history of US imperialism, whichever country do not agree with the US imperialism, they do not let their country to be robbed by the US imperialism. They try to change the government, change the regime over there. So that they can loot their natural sources as well as their labor power. So with this aim, they have carried out a number of provocations against Venezuela during the last few months. They have attacked more than 30 boats over there under the pretext that they were smuggling drugs to America without giving any evidence of that. And another excuse they are saying is that Venezuelan people are migrating to US. But the reason for migrating Venezuelan people from their country to US is that the sanction imposed by US imperialism over there, and there's lots of inflation over there, and people that's the reason behind the people migrating. So they have created these conditions. US imperialism has created these conditions over there. And now they are blaming the Venezuelan government for it. So the main aim, as Steve also said, is to occupy the oil sources as well as the other mineral sources over there.
Yeah, Jacob, perhaps you'd like to elaborate on this as well. What is the main aim of US doing what they've done in Venezuela?
Yeah, I think, I certainly agree with what everyone else has said about oil. I want to make it clear. I think we shouldn't discuss this seizure of resources as though it's like a phenomenal seizure, as though, Trump woke up yesterday and decided, oh, I fancy Venezuela's oil, let's go and get some. Um, the United States capitalism is in a deep crisis of profitability, and it's, therefore necessary for them to uh, take the mask off, so to speak, and he, just speaks very openly about, yeah, we want Venezuela's oil, and it's, you know, referring to it as ours, um, which is, it's useful in a sense because he's not couching that in any kind of masking language. I want to say as well, I think um, Venezuela represents a sort of the threat of a good example on America's doorstep. Um, for over 25 years now, Venezuela has used the wealth from its own resources to fund social programs and welfare programs for poor people in Venezuela. They've built 5 million units of social housing, created a free healthcare system. They eradicated illiteracy in 2005, and they built 52 new universities, which were all free to attend. And uh, this is a threat to United States capitalism that such a good example exists in such close proximity, and the United States doesn't want its own citizens to see such a good example and be inspired by it in any way. Um, and also internationally, Venezuela is a threat to the US because it represents a kind of a beacon of Latin American resistance and a direct sort of wall or block against imperialism in the region. And Venezuela is very open about its support for countries like Cuba, Palestine, Nicaragua, Sahel, Yemen, and that is a threat. Venezuela has declared its commitment to building socialism and creating a space for sort of participatory democracy in the region. Um, so it represents a political threat as well as an economic one, which I think is important to acknowledge.
Yeah, as Steve mentioned about China, that U.S. Is very much threatened by the rise of China. It doesn't want to have influence in that region. There are many factors, as all of you mentioned. And also imperialism means war. And whenever they face severe economic crisis, they are always involved in trying to capture other countries' resources, use their cheap labor. And we can see that happening in this case as well, that when he was saying, I'm going to have peace, he's actually declaring war on one country after another and even threatened Iran there. So that takes us to the question of sovereignty now, that each country has a right to decide what kind of system they want, and the people should be deciding there and not a foreign power. So what, Steve, on that one, on the question of sovereignty, perhaps you'd like to say a few words?
Yeah, I mean, look, the sovereignty in the West certainly goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia, which was they try to stop religious wars in Europe. But I think the sovereignty that we're talking about is kind of the post-war consensus, and I think that after the rules-based order, if you like, after the Second World War, the setting up the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, all these organizations, to try to ensure that there was a sort of peaceful alternative to countries going to war. And I think that Trump has driven a coach and horses right through that. I mean, and deliberately so, not just in the matters of sovereignty, but also on the matters of free trade, like imposing tariffs. So I think that this is just to me, it's naked imperialism. I think it's we never quite seen anything so brazen. I think we've all seen America behave appallingly. We've all seen Vietnam and Iraq, and Afghanistan and other countries, but they would somehow justify this as interfering in these countries as somehow restoring democracy or. But the veneer this time is really, really paper thin. They're not really even pretending to do that. This is naked self-interest. So the sovereignty in a nutshell is for people or country to decide its own affairs without outside interference, without interference from any other power. And Trump isn't interested in sovereignty. I mean, he's in his sort of rambling speech, he's more or less said that any country that doesn't agree with the US and doesn't allow the US to plunder its resources will be a target, you know. So I think the lines are very clearly drawn now. And I have to say this, but it's a horrible thing to say, but it seems that the only kind of protection from the US at the minute is either to be a military superpower or they have an atomic bomb. I don't see him invading North Korea or threatening to invade them because he knows they can hit back. And I think this is going to urge other countries, especially countries like Iran, to develop nuclear weapons just for their own safety. I think and other countries as well. I think are going to be on the to protect national sovereignty. There's going to be an arms race, and people are going to be looking for deterrence.
Yeah, Dalwinder, what do you think what could countries like Venezuela or Iran do? I mean, first, say a few words on sovereignty, and what could they do to protect themselves from this kind of bullying and interference in their affairs?
First of all, I would like to say that Venezuelan government has declared a national emergency in the country and called upon people to get armed and fight the US imperialism if it is uh, attacked by physically sending their army over there. And world's people should support this because if the US imperialism succeeds in the regime change over there, then they will also attack Iran, and also as Trump has already said about Gaza that they want to turn Gaza into their Rivera over there. And so it's very important that it is stopped, and otherwise there will be no chance to make American imperialism carry on the same path as it has been doing in the past.
Yes, acting as a bully and a policeman that, we are keeping the peace, but actually violating the sovereign rights of nations to decide for themselves what kind of system they want. And one of the speakers mentioned about the strides made in Venezuela in the sphere of education, the sphere of health. So that resources were being used to some extent to look after the well-being of the majority, and that could be a glaring example or a threat to these countries which exploit the working class and use those money to enrich the multinational big corporations there. And this all takes us to the next step, that the drugs now. Now, I was accused of using drugs as an issue. Dalwinder?
They will use any excuse to oppose, to try to change the regime, whichever government doesn't carry out its dictate.
And Steve, as you probably aware as well, that wasn't there recently one president of one of the Latin American countries who was involved in drugs, and Trump pardoned him. So there's an element of hypocrisy there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's absolutely no evidence that Maduro or anybody in the Venezuelan government have been involved in pushing drugs. I think fentanyl is the one that Trump keeps banging on about, and certainly there's no evidence that the Venezuelan government are pushing fentanyl. And it's obviously if you're a drugs dealer and you agree with Trump, you get a pardon. But if you're a president who's doesn't agree with Trump, then he will just make a wild allegation about you dealing drugs. I mean, we've seen this with Noriega and Panama and
Hmm.
all these other places in Central and South America where the US have intervened. And it's just, but I think that, I mean, even in that speech, the real reason, he's saying, look, these people nationalized American oil and gas companies, and we're going to get them back. I mean, that's what he said. I mean,
Yeah.
it's out there. So any kind of pretense, any sort of sheen that he wants to put on, it's just not credible because he's given the real reason in his speech.
Hmm. And yet, if you look at the history of British imperialism and US imperialism, they're the ones who have been driving drugs, driving the drug trade throughout the world. If you look at the opium wars that took place in China, and they used to grow opium in India and transport it to China and make them addicted, and there were the opium wars around the
To be
18th,
fair, that
19th
was British.
century.
That was a British.
You're quite right. It was British imperialism, and the Opium Wars was against the British imperialism. So it was. But I'm saying these imperialist countries do have that history, being involved in the drug trade themselves. A point was raised that by Dalwinder, the people are rising up. They're going to fight back. When the October Revolution occurred, these countries attacked the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the USS people. It's the working class that rose up and defended the socialist system against the attack by these imperialist countries. So hopefully there will be a similar uh, trend here that the working people will rise up and defend whatever gains they made in this sphere of economy serving them. Because Trump is saying, oh, he's going to use oil to uplift their standard. And what do you think, Jacob, about the economic sanctions? How are those helping to raise the standard of living of the Venezuelan people?
Yeah. I mean, Venezuela is a brilliant exception in that sanctions obviously have had an effect, but because of the basically because of their oil resources, they've been able to stave them off and still make progress in spite of them. And I think that is in large part why the United States has seen fit to escalate this warmongering to this current level, um, because basically sanctions haven't been sufficient to crush Venezuela and cause them trigger them to submit. Um, so yes, but they obviously have had a really devastating effect. Um, on the point about uh, you said on the point about workers rising up. Um, so for years now, the neighborhood communes in Venezuela have been training as sort of like guerrilla militias. There were over 5,000 communes communal circuits in Venezuela, um, and they've all been armed and trained by the state. So they're ready to defend the gains of the Bolivarian Revolution. Um, Venezuela also has quite a significant standing army as well. And in the lead up to the events of yesterday, something like 8 million people volunteered to join um, like peoples and peasants militias. So I think obviously the United States has gone for this very sort of limited attack where they've just, I say, just as though bombing civilians is ever a small thing, but a limited attack on one day and the kidnapping of the president and the first lady, and I think, the United States seems to think that if they sort of cut their head off, then the rest of the rest of it will fall. And I think they'll be sorely mistaken to find out that Venezuelans are ready, armed, trained to defend their revolution, which I think is really important to recognize.
Well, another important hypocrisy in the question of democracy, that only recently Trump has been using the US, the army, and even the police to suppress worker struggle within the United States, and yet he's talking about wanting to restore democracy in Venezuela and in Iran. And Steve, what would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, as you rightly say, he's been sending in the army to National Guard to cities that basically don't agree with him. And we, after he lost his the presidency the first time around, he tried to have a coup. I mean, he tried to have an undemocratic coup. He still doesn't accept the verdict of the American electorate when they voted him out. So democracy is a very pliable term, and when Trump uses it, democracy is anything that supports Trump or that Trump supports, and anything, any vote that goes against him, he either undermines it or rubbishes it or just doesn't recognize it. So, I mean, I've actually been to Venezuela. Helped oversee an election, and their voting system is far more robust than ours. You've got to have a thumbprint. They vote, and it goes on a card, and it's double checked. It's done manually and on computer, and it's tallied up. So I don't really understand his criticism of Venezuelan democracy. I think the criticism is more that the candidate that he preferred wasn't elected. So, as is his wont, he says that any decision that goes against him is somehow flawed, somehow corrupt, and invalid. So, I think the whole argument that this is being done for democratic purposes is just rubbish.
Yeah, I mean, there's only two types of systems, either your bourgeois democracy or your working class democracy. And what he's talking about is we wanted those candidates to come forward, those government which will serve the interests of the monopoly capitalists to get richer and richer using the resource and labor of Venezuela. And that's the sort of democracy they're speaking about. Dalwinder, in alternative to that, what kind of democracy should the working people have? If you compare bourgeois capitalist democracy, perhaps a few words on that, to working class democracy.
The capitalist system is promoting itself as a democratic system, but there is no real power in the hands of workers and peasants, all the working people. They have no right to have under the capitalist system. The government only carries out whatever is the agenda of the big monopoly capitalists, and only workers only have democracy only for one day. That's when they cast their vote. And after they have voted, they have no control over their candidate who they have chosen. And after that, whatever promises he makes during the campaign, afterwards, he cannot be held to account over there. He has to carry out the instructions of the party over there, and whichever party he belongs to. And in that way, there's no real democracy for the workers over there. They have no right to recall their representative if he doesn't carry out, if he doesn't work according to the wishes of the people who have chosen him.
Yeah, I mean, this system, whether it's Britain or United States, the capitalist system, decisions are already made by in the interest of big capitalists to further enrich their profits and safeguard them. And then people, as you said, only get right to vote once a year, and then they're not even consulted. Democracy means that people should have the right to make decisions, initiate legislation. Policies should stem from their needs, meeting their needs, and bring forward their representatives who are accountable to them. And if they don't fulfill the wishes of the membership or the people who elected them, then they should be recalled. Steve, perhaps you'd just like to say a few words in comparing these two democracies. What would work as democracy in contrast to what we have here? Because elections are coming up, council elections, then you got parliamentary elections. Perhaps you can say a few words on the contrast, what kind of democracy exists and what it should be.
Well,
People are not even asked about the major policy decisions. They are not consulted by the capitalist system, and they are for example, about Gaza, millions and millions of people in Britain have demonstrated every week initially, and that means people do not want the British government to support the attack on Gazan people by Israel. But does government listen to the people? So what kind of democracy is over there?
Steve, what would you like to say on that?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, I don't think we should be holding up the Venezuelan democracy as some sort of workers' democracy. It's not. It's very much a bourgeois democracy in a lot of respects. The fact is that you don't have like workers' councils deciding things. You do have a lot more democracy than workers' democracy than you would have in Britain, for example, but it wouldn't be on the scale of Cuba. So the Venezuelan picture is very mixed, and I don't think Trump's objection to democracy in Venezuela is that it's a workers' democracy and not a bourgeois democracy. Trump's only objection is it's not delivering the candidates that he wants in power. So yeah, I mean, workers' democracy obviously would be preferential if we had workers' councils deciding things and workers' representatives that were instantly recallable. It would be a massive step forward. But I don't think that's what we're talking about in Venezuela. We're talking about really a version of bourgeois democracy that
You're
Trump.
quite right, Steve, in the sense that yeah, only if you had a full workers' power in a country, like we have the productive force of the working class, and then you got the relations of production. If this is social ownership and social relations of production, only then the contradiction of capitalism is solved. And if only the workers were fully involved in the decision-making process, as I mentioned before. And yet, that also reflects that there still were many companies, multinationals, that were present in Venezuela. You either have a complete revolution with the workers in power, but if you have any scope of big corporates or multinationals also being present there, then that gives them the scope to use their capital and power to overthrow any system that may be anti-imperialist or have facets of socialist ideas. What would you like to say on that, Jacob?
I would I think okay. We're using the word democracy a lot, and I think that's good. But we're referring a lot to elections, and I think democracy goes a lot deeper than that, runs a lot deeper than that. I mean, Steve mentioned Cuba, and I think obviously if you look at how Cuban elections are run, you see, a shining example of a what democracy could look like. But I think democracy in Cuba runs so much deeper because it's from the day you're born in Cuba, you are sort of educated and built up into like a politically active person. And I think if you just sort of transferred the voting system from say Cuba to Britain, that wouldn't like magically make Britain's democracy good because it's a much more fundamental question. And on the subject of uh, Venezuelan democracy, I think, yeah, if we just look at the voting system, then I think you might see holes or something. But the what's really exciting about what's happening in Venezuela is the development of communal councils. So just as a really brief thing, there are about, I think the last time I checked, there are about 60,000 communal councils, um, running about 5,000 or just over 5,000 communes. And these are uh, essentially sort of neighborhood organizations which have a democratic control over the means of production and the resources in those neighborhoods. And the state, as run by the Socialist Party, supports these and funds them. And it's an explicit goal of the Bolivarian Revolution. It's an explicit goal of Nicolas Maduro to transfer state functions and resources to the communes over time, which is a really exciting project. And I think that's an example of the kind of a more fundamental democracy of people running their own lives, and really the sort of embryonic form of workers' democracy as you were describing it. Um, the the slogan in the Bolshevik Revolution, the slogan wasn't, oh, dismantle capitalist state power and replace it with workers' state power. The slogan was all power to the Soviets, because the Soviets already existed. The councils already existed, and it was just a case of transferring power to these already existing organs of working class democracy. And I think in the communes, in the communal councils, we're seeing the the construction of those organs. And I think that's really important to acknowledge when we're talking about democracy in Venezuela. And again, the threat that Venezuela poses. And just lastly, it's obvious it's a fantastic counter argument to anybody who would dare to say something as stupid as calling Maduro a dictator, because more than anything, he's transferred power from the state to the people, and armed them and militarily trained them. So if he is a dictator, he's not a very clever one.
Well, in the real sense, there's no such thing as democracy. It's a dictatorship. Either you have dictatorship in the interest of working people who produce wealth, and they have a right to that wealth to be used to advance their interest, and you got to protect that. Or it's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalist class. And we see the way the state operates in these countries. They use the police, they use the army to suppress people's struggle. Look how many arrests have taken place in Britain for those who've been demonstrating in support of the right of Palestinians for their homeland. And look at what's happening to the hunger strikers. What kind of democracy is that? Where they've been kept from one jail to another place, and all they're saying is there should be no arms shipments to Israel. And so really, and people are being oppressed. And that's a dictatorship in the interest of the big capitalist, of the war industry there. And this also takes us to the question of economics. So what kind of economics? Do we have a mixed, should there be a capitalist type of system which is profit-based, defends the interest of big corporates, capitalists, and pretend to think they're looking after the people? Look how the National Health Service has been eroded, how privatization is taking place. And that is actually, and fascism is increasing towards a dictatorship more and more in favor of the capitalist class. In contrast to what happened in the Soviet Union, they said, yes, we got a dictatorship of the working class. We're not going to allow exploitation of the workers. We're not going to allow the kulaks and big landlords to hoard and speculate and ruin and cause famines in our country. So at the moment, history is going through the struggle. Either we have one form of dictatorship or another. The question is in whose class interest. Steve, any comments on that?
Yeah, look, I think that Venezuela is kind of stuck between the stools. It's neither a complete bourgeois democracy, and it's certainly not a worker state. And I think that's why it's vulnerable. The transition hasn't really been made. They've tried to balance, even if you look back at Chavez, Chavez talked about socialism for the 21st century. He didn't adopt the Cuban model. He didn't adopt the Soviet model. He did try to have an economy that did still have private enterprise in it. And I think fundamentally that was the weakness, and is the weakness of Venezuela that Trump is exploiting. Their attack when they tried to overthrow Chavez, the people that rallied to him were the working class and the poor. And I think that probably in the same situation again. Look, let's not pretend, right, that there are not forces within Venezuela that want Maduro gone. There are. The bourgeoisie, the native bourgeoisie in Venezuela, have really their position's been undermined. They've been forced to share their wealth for the first time. And before Chavez took power, the Venezuelan peasant and the Venezuelan worker were really very uneducated. That they weren't even they had very basic education. If any illiteracy was rampant, and the division of wealth was astronomically skewed in the favor of the ruling elites, and they resent sharing any of that money with other people. So there is a native bourgeoisie who are very, very hostile to Maduro. I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that. And Trump will use these people if he can. But with a fact is, I think this might be the point now which pushes that the threat of counter-revolution may actually ensure that there is a proper revolution in Venezuela, a sort of socialist revolution in Venezuela, completes the socialist revolution, if you like, because I don't think there's any alternative now. I don't think that if Maduro survives this, then he can allow these corporate capitalism to have a hold in Venezuela, which they can use to undermine Venezuelan democracy.
A very important point you mentioned, Steve, that you either have a complete revolution where the working class is in full power, but if you have a mixed economy, mixed hybrid system, where you still got the presence of capitalist industry, capitalists there, that gives you scope for those capitalists to use their money power, use their influence to cause internal strife and even overthrow of systems, as is happening, or just happening in Venezuela, or they're trying to overthrow. While there are facets of strides being made in the interest of people, but the presence of multinational corporations does give them that opportunity to restore capitalism in serving the interest of big imperialist powers there. So it's quite an important point. That takes the question of economy. I mean, the economy is either serves the interest of working people, and the wealth they produce is used in their interest to provide education, provide health, housing, full employment, as happened in the Soviet Union, where it was a socialist system. So either you got a revolution for a complete socialist revolution, but if you leave it halfway hybrid, then it poses that danger. What do you think, Dalwinder, on that?
You're right, like when you say that there is not a complete socialist revolution in Venezuela. As Marx said, the kinds of democracy at the moment. One is bourgeois democracy, and the other, which was established in Soviet Union, was proletarian dictatorship. That was bourgeois dictatorship and proletariat dictatorship. But the real democracy will only come when the state itself as a system is abolished, where people, as Marx said, work according to their ability and take from the society according to their needs. Only then there will be complete democracy in the world.
Yep. Jacob, your views on who empowering the working class to be in complete power compared to hybrid type of systems. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've seen in Venezuela up to this point, we've seen what a kind of so-called hybrid system entails. I think we need to be careful about straying into sort of chauvinist arguments about Venezuela. Not that I'm accusing anyone here of doing that yet, but I think we have to be careful about how we discuss the process of revolution in Venezuela and the pressures that they were under. Particularly Chavez was under a huge amount of imperialist aggression and pressure. And I think Steve, not to criticize you because I think this was just a wording thing, but the idea of you said, oh, Chavez didn't adopt the Cuban model or the Soviet model. I think um, if we're approaching this from a Marxist point of view, we have to acknowledge that every country has to sort of um, adapt its strategy and its tactics to the context that it's in and the struggle as it stands in that moment, and that doesn't always work out in the way that it was intended to. But as a sort of positive point of hope here, I think one of the biggest kind of mistakes I think that people make when they start to read about the history of socialism and stuff like that is that they understand revolutions as like one incredible day where everything changes. And I think it's much more dialectical and much more important to recognize that revolutions are a process. And if you speak to Cubans, they know this. They don't think of, July 1st, 1959 as their revolution, and then everything after that was post-revolution. They consider the revolution happening right now, a process that takes time. And I think the same is true in Venezuela. Yes, incomplete, if we want to call it that. Um, but it's a constant struggle against their still existing bourgeois institutions and capitalist owners, and a vibrant socialist movement both in the streets and in the parliamentary sphere. And
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
so it's a process.
It is true that every country has to learn from previous revolution struggles, such as the Paris Commune, such as the Soviet Union, but adapt to the strategy tactic to their situation. But ultimately, it is a question of who who is in power. Is it going to be the working class or press sections, or is it going to be monopoly capitalists? There. And if you look at every struggle that's taking place in Britain, look, we go on massive protests, we go on demonstrations, we march, and we get ignored. All our efforts are being ignored, and capitalists carry on dissipating our energies in that way, arresting protesters, demonstrators. And yet, all of them, whether it's our struggle for the right of the Palestinian people, or whether it's a struggle against privatization, or which is in the interest of the capitalist class, or whether it's against racism, they all stem from the capitalist system, which is safeguarding his interest and his rule over the working and oppressed sections. And revolution can only be a change of that system when the people are empowered to be in power. And if we leave it halfway, then it always gives a scope for the bourgeoisie to come back to power. Whereas in the Soviet Union, they really clamped down on the possibilities of the bourgeoisie coming to power. Ultimately, it did when things went wrong slightly, when bureaucracy developed. So these are lessons to be learned in history, and each country has to learn from those lessons, adopt strategy and tactics according to their situations. And ultimately, be the question of state power, in whose interest, who with state power, and how the working class, which has been making tremendous sacrifices, is actually comes to power and holds on to that power in their interest, and they deny the capitalists any comeback or come back to power in that way. That history has to move forward, in, I believe, in that direction. What do you think, Steve, learning from the past, and which way should the people in Britain go?
Well, I mean, look, no one's saying that you copy and paste the Soviet Revolution or the Cuban Revolution, and you just say, well, we're going to do that in our country. Obviously, every country has got its own circumstances. But the reality is this, if you don't do that, you end up like Nicaragua, or you end up like Paraguay, or you end up like one of these other Chile, one of these other countries. If you adapt a soft left strategy and you make reforms, and a lot of the reforms in Venezuela would I think fall in the ambit of social democratic reforms that were made in Britain after the Second World War. You know, the foundation of the health service, free education, free health care, that kind of thing. But if you don't actually take on the question of capitalism, and it's not like it's not really a choice. If you don't take on the capitalist interests and the bourgeois interests in your own country and defeat them, then they will defeat you. You can't stand still. You can't have some sort of equilibrium where, you know, you'll have these reforms and the capitalists will accept them. No, they'll claw them back one by one, and when they can, they'll get rid of you if you're a socialist government or you're a progressive government. So that's the choice. And when I say you have to finish the revolution, that's exactly what I mean. You have to finish the revolution. You can't have a halfway house, because any halfway house will be insecure, far more insecure than a finished revolution.
You're quite right. Ultimately, either the working class is in power or the capitalists in power. Either they're the decision makers or the capitalists are decision makers through the system like the Westminster model they use, or the economy either serves the interest of the working people who are the producer of wealth, or it serves the interest of capitalists. So you can't be halfway, as you said, one way or the other. But that is my final question on the impending danger of world war, which people are very worried about, very concerned. And you got big powers now. You got China being threatened as a result of what happened in Venezuela. You got Russia also have given a warning to the US. China's given a warning because their own interests are threatened as to then they need those resources as well, and not dominated by one power or another. So how do you think that people can prevent the danger of a world war, Steve?
I don't. That's the. I mean, we can campaign. We can. We have campaigned. We are campaigning. But ultimately, the balance of forces, certainly in this country, are such that the trade union movement is completely craven and emasculated. They're not the workers' movement as such is not credible. We haven't even had strikes against the genocide in Gaza like they've had in other countries.
Mm, yeah.
So to think that somehow the workers' movement's going to come to our aid against the world war at this point in time is I think fanciful. I mean, things can change very rapidly. I hope they do. But we have to still campaign in that arena. We still have to campaign against against wars, the Stop the War Coalition, but it's almost a permanent coalition, that Stop the War Coalition. It was supposed to be an ad hoc thing, wasn't it? But we've had wars for the last 30 years. We just had one after another, and we haven't seemed to stop any of those wars yet. You know, which war are we trying to stop now? I don't know. They all kind of roll into one. But look, I think that the ultimately international solidarity between workers has got to be built. We're the people that are going to suffer from any war, and I think war's happening. I mean, I think if you look at the state of Europe at the minute, there's a war happening between NATO and Russia. That's ongoing in the Ukraine. It's not a Ukraine-Russian war; it's a Ukraine-NATO war. You've got the conflicts still in Palestine, around the Middle East, with Israel attacking all its neighbors. That's all ongoing. We're now having these battles in Central America. We've got battles, all perhaps battles that are going to kick off in Africa again, around Somalia, Somaliland. The world is in a state of war. I mean, will there be a clash between America and China over Taiwan? I think America are trying to engineer that in a way. I mean, it seems that they're trying to engineer that. They've certainly got Russia in the a war that's very damaging to Russia, the Russian economy, the Russian working class in that war with Ukraine. So I don't know is the answer. I think the prognosis is pretty bleak. We should do everything that we can, build international links. They stop the war, but can we stop it at the minute? I'm very doubtful.
Dalwinder, what do you think? What can the people do to prevent the danger of a world war happening?
So this question is not straightforward how you can do it. But the thing is, as long as the capitalist system is alive, the wars will continue. And as you have seen, the only way to stop a war is like in the Soviet Union when they drew from the Second World War, no, First World War. Only then it came to an end. And but as long as the system carries on like this, because the imperialists have different aims. Every imperialist country has its own agenda, its own interest, and these wars will continue. And only the people can stop these wars. But when it will happen, I don't know. But every country has its own situation, and people have to fight, carry out the revolution in their own countries according to their own situation, and that way only wars will be stopped.
Jacob, your views on that? What can the people do to prevent the impending danger of World War III?
Just a small question to finish, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, in an attempt to offer some sort of a bit of hope here, uh, I think, we have to remember that the the movement that became the Red October, the revolution in Russia, was an anti-war movement, and uh, I think Lenin, in addressing the International Socialists, he said, "You turn the imperialist war into a civil war," and I think, there is certainly we have to believe that that is possible in this era, in our current epoch, or I think we sort of condemn the world to sink into barbarism. Um, and yeah, Steve's right. It's a case of building international uh, building international solidarity, recognizing that we as working class people in this country have far more in common with the people of Palestine, people of Venezuela, people of Cuba, etc., than our own bourgeoisie. And should the time come for should the time come for some, these kind of global conflicts, and the bourgeoisie is demanding its own working class to fight other working classes in other countries to redivide the world, then that would be the basis for rebellion. And you know, I think as well we have to recognize that the working class in Britain is quite, or the mass of the working class in Britain, I should say, is quite alienated right now. Cost of living crisis, destruction of state welfare and stuff like that. The stakes that people have in the capitalist system are withering away bit by bit, and we're getting to a place where they have only to gain from an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist movement in this country. Um, and I'll quote Lenin again because I think it's very useful. Um, he has this point. He makes this point about the First World War. And he says a bayonet or a rifle is a weapon with a worker at both ends. I think that's a really important point that needs to be emphasized and pushed in the streets, that again, we have far more in common with Venezuela, with Palestine, than we do with our own bourgeoisie, and that is the basis for an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movement in this country. One that is, as we've been saying all day, necessary, the only choice.
Yeah, quite right. I mean, whenever there's been wars, it's the revolutionary struggle of that stopped those wars. Wars, if you like, the October Revolution was in 1917. The World War ended very soon after that. And you take the Second World War when Soviet Union defeated Hitlerite fascism, and the upsurge in the Chinese anti-imperialist struggle there, and the World War, the capitalists get more scared of rising tide of people's revolutionary struggles, and that's when they stop fighting each other because they're more threatened by the systems being destroyed, and therefore the intensification of revolutionary struggles within each country of the workers fighting for their rights against privatization, against racism, against onslaught of their rights. And Steve mentioned a very important point about the trade unions as well, that the workers got to make sure that their organizations represent their interest and fight for their interest. And it is this rising tide of revolutionary struggles within each country and throughout the world, and expressing solidarity with each other, struggles against, on anti-imperialist basis, against, and also defending the sovereignty of other countries, all linked to the same thing. It's a struggle against imperialism, struggle against capitalism, and hopefully the working class, either one or a number of countries, will rise up to overthrow the system, establish socialist system, and then it becomes a torrent, a current, where it could even end up in a worldwide situation. And hopefully, we're not going to give up hope. We're not going to feel pessimistic. It's our duty to make sure the revolutionary struggles in each country sharpens, and we continue to build the united front at a national, each country as well as the international level, against the very system that oppresses and endangers all.